Kira Hayes stood in the center of the cargo bay, with her arms loose at her sides, and her breathing slow and steady like she had all the time in the world. Even though 30 weapons were pointed directly at her chest and head and every other vital spot the aliens could identify on a human body, the station hummed around her with that artificial sound that all space structures made. When they were trying to keep everyone alive in the cold vacuum, and she could feel the vibration through her boots on the metal floor and smell the recycled air that tasted like copper and fear ember, crouched beside her with obsidian scales, catching the harsh overhead lights and turning them into fragments of reflected fire. And the dragon was small compared to what she would become one day, but already she was the size of an earth horse with wings, folded tight against her muscular body and a tail that could break bones with a casual flick to Mander. Zirith stood at the entrance to the bay, with his reptilian features arranged in what might have been satisfaction, or hunger, or both, since his species did not express emotion the way humans did, and his scales were a deep green that reminded Kira of forests she would never see again, because Earth was gone, and all its forests with Ith, spoke in his hissing language, and the translator clipped to his uniform belt turned it into flat, emotionless words that echoed in the space between them and made everything sound like a computer. Reading a grocery list instead of a death sentence. Surrender human, and you cannot win, and the Council requires you alive for study and research and understand. Inkir did not answer right away because she was counting exits and measuring distances and calculating angles the way her xenobiology training had taught her to observe and categorize and survive in hostile environments. And this cargo bay was definitely a hostile environment, even if it looked like just another room the mercenaries Zirith had hired were a mix of species, and she recognized Kresh warriors with their 4 arms and energy blades, and Vorian soldiers with their insect-like armor and cluster eyes, and even a few Dralith, who were supposed to be peaceful traders, but clearly had no problem pointing weapons at an unarmed
woman.
If the pay was good enough, she could see the structural weaknesses in the walls where the metal panels joined together and where the support beams ran behind the surface, and where the outer hull was thinnest, because Station Helix 7 was old and patched together from salvage and held together more by hope than proper engineering. Below her feet, she could feel the thrum of the gravity generators that kept everyone stuck to the floor instead of floating in zero gravity, and those generators had a rhythm like a heartbeat if you knew how to listen, and Kira had learned to listen to everything because listening kept you alive. Member made a sound deep in her chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a purr, but something in between that resonated through their bond and made Kira feel it in her own chest, like they shared lungs, and maybe they did in some way that science could not explain, yet their bond was neural and ancient and forged in fire during Earth's final days when reality itself was tearing apart and desperate. Humans were finding desperate solutions, and Kira had pressed her hand to an egg that was warm like a star and felt something click into place inside her soul. The dragon's eyes were like molten gold, with vertical pupils that could track movement faster than most species could blink and write. Now those eyes were watching the soldiers with the patient focus of a predator. That knew it was faster and stronger and more dangerous than anything else in the rooms. Took a step forward, and his clawed feet clicked on the metal floor, and he gestured with one scaled hand at his soldiers to tighten the circle, and they moved in perfect formation like they had trained for this exact scenario, and probably had, because the Council was very good at training people to capture things they did not understand. You are the last free human in this sector, and the others have been collected for their own protection and safety, and you will join them and submit to authority. Kira felt her lips curve into something that was not quite a smile, because there was no humor in it and no joy, but there was definitely amusement at how little these aliens understood about what they were dealing with and how badly they had miscalculated by cornering her. Here she whispered something to Ember in a language that had no words, because their communication went deeper than speech and traveled along the neural pathways that connected their minds, and the dragon understood instantly and completely, the way bonded pairs always did. Embers scales began to shimmer with heat, and the temperature in the cargo bay started to rise degree by degree, and the soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their armor, because most species did not handle heat as well as humans did, and definitely not as well as Voidrix did. Kira counted down in her head, while her eyes tracked every soldier, and every weapon and every possible trajectory, and she calculated probabilities, the way Earth's apex predators had always calculated when they were surrounded by prey that thought it was the hunter. 10 seconds, and that was all the time they had left, although they did not know it yet. 9 seconds end. Ember's claws scraped against the floor, leaving marks in the metal that glowed faintly red from the heat building in the dragon's body. 8 seconds, and Kira shifted her weight slightly too, her left foot, and bent her knees just a fraction of an inch in preparation for movement that would be faster than most species could tracks. 7 seconds, and one of the mercenaries near the back of the circle glanced at his companion with uncertainty, starting to show in his body language because something felt wrong, even if he could not identify what. 6 seconds, and the gravity generators beneath the floor continued their steady rhythm, but Kira knew exactly where they were positioned and exactly how much damage it would take to disrupt them in a localized area. 5 seconds, and Xerath raised his hand to give an order, but the words never left his mouth because events were already in motion and nothing he could say would stop what was coming. For seconds, and Ember's eyes blazed brighter and her wings twitched against her sides, and fire began to flicker between her teeth like she was tasting the air and finding it lacking. 3 seconds, and Kira felt the bond surge between them and felt Ember's power become her power and her strategy become the dragon's instinct, and they moved as one being with two bodies. Seconds, and the first soldier squeezed his trigger, but Kira was already moving, and the plasma bolt passed through empty air where she had been standing a microsecond before. 1 second, and Ember opened her mouth, and reality itself seemed to pause before the fire came. Zeratha. The cargo bay erupted into chaos and light and heat that turned metal into liquid, and armor into ash, and the sound was like thunder compressed into a space too small to contain it. And the shockwave hit the walls with force that made the entire station shudder. Kira moved through the destruction like water flowing around rocks, and her human reflexes that had been honed by millions of years of evolution on a Deathworld were faster than the aliens expected, and faster than their training had prepared them. For she grabbed a weapon from a soldier who was already falling, and used it against 3 others before they could turn, and then dropped it because guns were slow compared to what she could do. With her hands and feet and the brutal efficiency of close combat, timber was a storm of claws and fire and wings that generated wind strong enough to knock soldiers off their feet, and her tail whipped around to crush armor and break bones, and her roar shattered energy shields through harmonic frequencies that made the aliens scream. The structural weak point Kira had identified earlier took 3 direct hits from Ember's plasma breath, and the metal glowed white, then red, then simply ceased to exist. And the vacuum of space howled through the opening like a hungry beast. Soldiers were pulled toward the breach, and their screams cut off as they tumbled into the void and the station's emergency systems kicked in, but too slowly to save everyone, and certainly not fast enough to stop what was happening. Kira felt the gravity fluctuate as the generators struggled to compensate, and she used the momentary weightlessness to launch herself toward an access panel that would take her to the maintenance tunnels, and Freedom Ember followed with wings spread wide and fire trailing behind her like a comet, and together they disappeared into the depths of the station, while behind them the cargo bay continued to tear itself apart. Lay near the entrance with his arm missing and his mind struggling to process what had just happened and how 30 elite soldiers had been reduced to nothing in less time than it took to draw breath. Last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was the image of a young human woman with auburn hair vanishing into darkness, followed by a dragon whose scales reflected the fire of destroyed lives, and he understood finally what Deathworld meant. It meant that everything on that planet had been trying to kill everything else for billions of years, and the things that survived became very, very good at killing back. The distress signal from Station Helix 7 reached Council warships within minutes, and they came burning through space with their engines at maximum thrust because stations did not send emergency broadcasts unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Admiral Victoria Cross stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the tactical display update with information that made less sense the more she studied it. and her officers were reporting data that contradicted itself in physics, and common understanding of how combat worked. The cargo bay was gone, and not just damaged or destroyed, but completely absent, like someone had used a massive cutting tool to remove 3 entire decks of the station, and the edges of the missing section were melted smooth like glass and still radiating heat signatures that made the sensors struggle. Structural supports that should have been holding up tons of metal and equipment were twisted into shapes that looked more like abstract art than engineering, and the pattern of destruction radiated outward from a central point in ways that suggested an explosion, but the forensics did not match any known weapon or explosive device. 27 soldiers were dead, and the forensics teams were having difficulty determining cause of death because there was not enough left of most of them to perform proper analysis, and what they did find was scattered across such a wide area that reconstruction seemed impossible. 3 soldiers had been vaporized completely with only trace elements in the air to prove they had existed at all, and the heat required to do that to a living being in full combat armor was astronomical and terrifying. 2 had been pulled through the hull breach into space, and their bodies were recovered floating in the debris field around the station, and their faces were frozen in expressions of shock. And Terra Commander Zareth was alive, but barely, and the medical team had him in a regeneration tank, trying to regrow his missing arm and repair the psychological damage that seemed even worse than the physical injuries. He kept repeating the same phrases over and over through the sedatives and the trauma and the neural shock that made his words slur together into desperate warnings: fast and too fast, and human and dragon and fire everywhere in 10 seconds, and only 10 seconds in Deathworld and Apex and Predator. And we never had a chance. The mercenaries who had taken his money were mostly gone, with only 5 survivors, and they had fled the moment they could reach their ships, and 3 of them had already left Council space entirely, because no amount of credits was worth facing what they had. Synod Admiral Cross reviewed the security footage for the 7th time and watched Kira Hayes move through trained soldiers like they were standing still, and her reflexes were so fast that the recording had to be slowed down to half speed just to track her movements clearly. The human grabbed weapons and used them, and discarded them in the span of heartbeats, and transitioned between targets with efficiency that spoke of extensive training or natural instinct or both. And never once did she hesitate or waste motion or chauffeurant. Ember was worse or better depending on perspective, and the Void Drake moved with grace that belied her size and power, and her plasma breath was hotter than the core of most stars, according to the sensor readings, which should have been impossible. For a biological creature, the dragon's roar had shattered energy shields through harmonic resonance, and the science team was still trying to figure out how that worked, because sound waves should not be able to disrupt energy fields, and yet clearly they had. But what made Admiral Cross feel cold despite the climate-controlled bridge was the tactical precision, and Kira had not just fought back randomly, but had orchestrated the entire battle and used the soldiers' own formation against them, and turned their coordinated assault into a massacre. She had identified the structural weak points before the fighting started, and positioned herself and Ben Ember to exploit them, and created an escape route through a hole in exactly the right place to cripple the station without destroying it completely or killing civilians in other sections. The human had given innocence time to evacuate, and that spoke to rules and honor even in the middle of combat, and somehow that made her more dangerous, because random violence was predictable but controlled. Violence with purpose was something else entirely. Video footage spread across the galactic network faster than the Council could suppress it, and every species with access to communication technology was watching and sharing and commenting and panicking. A young woman with auburn hair tied back in a practical style, moving like liquid death, and her face calm and focused and almost sad, like she regretted the necessity but would not flinch from doing what needed to be done. Dragon wreathed in fire, conducting symphonies of destruction, and her scales reflecting impossible colors, and her eyes burning with intelligence that suggested she understood exactly what she was doing, and why. Their commentary that accompanied the footage ranged from disbelief to a terror to a strange kind of admiration, and the most common question being asked was how one human and one dragon had defeated 30 elite soldiers in less time than it took to brew teeth an answer was becoming clear to those who studied Earth's history and ecology and evolutionary pressure, and what it meant to come from a planet that had spent billions of years trying to kill everything that lived on it. Humans were not the strongest species or the fastest or the most armored, but they were adaptable and persistent and capable of extreme violence when threatened, and their bodies were designed for endurance and pursuit and the kind of hunting that involved running prey to exhaustion over days. Their reflexes were faster than most species, because on Earth needed fast reflexes to avoid predators or catch food, and their ability to process visual information and make decisions in fractions of seconds was unmatched among known intelligent life, and their bond with creatures like voidrakes suggested something deeper and older than the Council had understood, and possibly connected to the dimensional energies that had destroyed Earth and scattered humanity across the stars. The Council convened an emergency session and declared Kira Hayes a Level 9 threat, which was a designation reserved for extinctional dangers, like rogue artificial intelligences or reality-warping entities or cosmic disasters. Every bounty hunter in civilized space received notification of the threat level and the reward being offered, and the stern warning that capture was preferred, but lethal force was authorized, if necessary. Military forces across Council territory went to high alert and began coordinating search patterns and sharing intelligence and preparing for combat against a single human woman and her dragon companion. Admiral Cross read the official briefing and felt her stomach twist, because she recognized what others did not seem to understand yet, and this was not just about one human or one dragon, but about what humanity represented as a whole. If there were more like Kira out there hiding among the stars, or waiting in labor colonies, or scattered across refugee settlements, then the galaxy's entire power structure was built on false assumptions about who the predators were. She pulled up files on the other human survivors that the Council had collected and studied their faces in the database, photographs, and saw mostly fear and exhaustion and grief, but occasionally she saw something else in their eyes. She saw patience and calculation and the kind of waiting that predators did when they were biding their time and studying their surroundings and preparing for the moment when they would act. One file in particular caught her attention, and it was a woman named Claire Brooks, who had been placed in a research facility after her rescue and who had escaped 3 weeks ago using methods that the security team still could not explain. Another was a man named Jake Morrison, who had survived alone on a hostile moon for 6 months before being found, and who reportedly could navigate by the stars and hunt local wildlife with tools made from rocks and sticks. There were 43 humans left in Council space, according to official records, and 43 survivors of a species that had conquered their own Deathworld through intelligence and persistence and violence. When necessary, Admiral Cross closed the files and looked at the star chart that showed known human locations and escape vectors that Kira might take and strategic targets she might hit. Next, she thought about her own 3 daughters, safe on their homeworld, and what she would do if someone had destroyed their planet and scattered their people and lied about it and hunted the survivors like specimens. She thought about honor and duty and the oath she had sworn to protect Council citizens from threats both external and internal, and she wondered what happened when the threat was not external at all, but internal corruption and lies and crimes committed by the very institution she served. The bridge crew waited for her orders, and the fleet waited for direction, and the galaxy waited to see how the Council would respond to this new terrifying reality. Admiral Cross made her decision and began plotting intercept courses, but somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, they were hunting the wrong enemy, and that voice sounded suspiciously like her own conscience. Finally waking up after years of sleeping through injustice, the shattered belt was a graveyard of ships and stations from a war so old that most species had forgotten who fought it, or why, and the debris fields stretched across a region of space where sensors went haywire and navigation required instinct. More than instruments, Kira guided her small ship through the wreckage with practiced ease, and her hands moved over the controls with the kind of confidence that came from spending 2 cycles running and hiding and learning to fly by necessity. Rather than training, Ember was coiled in the cargo hold because she had grown too large to fit comfortably in the cockpit anymore, and through their bond, Kira could feel the dragon's discomfort and restlessness and the ache from plasma burns that scored her scales in patterns like lightning. The asteroid Kira had claimed as her temporary home appeared on the view screen looking like any other rock in the belt. And that was exactly the point, because anything that looked interesting or valuable would have been stripped by salvagers generations ago. She landed in a crater that she had modified with stolen equipment to serve as a concealed hangar, and the ship settled onto the rocky surface with a soft thud that echoed through the empty space inside the hollowed out asteroid. The air was thin, but breathable, and the temperature was cold, enough that her breath misted in front of her face, and the walls were rough stone that she had covered in places with salvaged insulation panels. Squeezed through the airlock and immediately headed for the warm spot where Kira had rigged a heating unit to create something like a nest, and the dragon collapsed with a sigh that was half pain and half relief. Kira knelt beside her and ran her hands over the plasma burns with gentle pressure to assess the damage, and Ember rumbled deep in her chest in that way that meant it hurt. But she trusted Kira to make it better. The burns were not life-threatening, but they were extensive, and the scales were cracked and blackened and would take weeks to heal properly. And Kira applied the medical gel she had stolen from a council supply depot and wrapped the worst areas in regenerative bandages. Through their bond, she could feel Ember's pain like it was her own, and that was the price of their connection, and she would not trade it for anything, because being alone in the universe was worse than sharing her. The dragon had taken these injuries defending her, stepping between Kira and plasma fire that would have killed a human instantly, and that was what family did, and they were family even if they were different. Specious Kira sat back against the wall and let herself feel exhaustion for the first time in days, and her muscles ached and her hands shook slightly from adrenaline withdrawal, and her mind was full of images she could not forget. She closed her eyes, and the memories came without invitation, the way they always did when she stopped moving long enough for them to catch up. She remembered Earth, and not the dying version that everyone saw at the end, but the living, breathing, beautiful version that had existed before the dimensional rifts started tearing reality apart. She remembered forests with trees so tall they seemed to touch the sky, and oceans that stretched to the horizon in shades of blue and green that no other planet had managed to replicate. She remembered her sister Lily with her bright laugh and terrible jokes, and the way she would steal food off Kira's plate when she thought no one was looking. Lily had been 3 years younger, and so full of life and plans and dreams about exploring the galaxy once humanity figured out faster than light travel without using dimensional shortcuts. Kira had been a xenobiologist studying the dragons that had started appearing in Earth's wildlands during the final generation, and they were not mythological creatures but real flesh and blood animals that seemed connected to the same dimensional energies that were destroying the planet. She had bonded with Ember when the dragon was still an egg and felt warmth like touching a star, and something had clicked into place inside her soul and created a connection that went deeper than words or thoughts. When the evacuation began, it was already too late, and there were not enough ships and never enough time, and the council representatives who arrived to help brought vessels that barely held a fraction of the population. Kira and Lily had been assigned to different transports because the system prioritized spreading families across multiple ships in case of accidents, and that decision had killed her sister Shay. Watched from her emergency pod with Ember coiled around her, and both of them screaming as Lily's transport vanished into a dimensional rift that opened like a mouth and swallowed the ship whole. 4,000 people gone in an instant, and her sister among them, and the last thing Kira saw was the ship's distress beacon blinking desperately before it disappeared into nothing. The council had covered it up and classified Earth's destruction as a natural disaster and scattered the survivors across labor colonies and research stations and claimed it was for their protection. But Kira had found a data broker named Pip who specialized in exposing corruption, and Pip had shown her classified files that proved that Council had known their dimensional experiments were destabilizing the sector. They had evacuated their own species first and delayed warning Earth until it was too late, and then blamed humanity's primitive technology for the disaster acceptable. Loss was the phrase used in the official reports, and 43 survivors out of 9 billion people was apparently acceptable to the Council. Kira had learned this truth 6 months ago, and something inside her had changed from grief to cold determination, and she stopped running and started planning. She stood up and walked to the makeshift console she had assembled from salvaged parts and pulled up a star chart that showed Council territory with markers for targets. She had identified 3 research stations where humans were being held for study and 2 military depots that supplied the forces hunting her, and 1 classified facility that might hold records of other survivors. She would hit them systematically and precisely and give innocents time to evacuate, but anyone who stood in her way would learn what it meant to fight someone from a Deathworld. Umber raised her head, and golden eyes reflected the console's light, and through their bond, Kira felt the dragon's agreement and support and readiness to continue fighting. They were not victims anymore, and they were survivors of a planet that had tried to kill everything for billions of years, and they had learned the lessons that Earth taught about adaptation and persistence and controlled violence. Kira pulled up the first target and began planning her infiltration route and escape vectors and backup contingencies, because proper planning was the difference between success and becoming. At another statistics, she would expose what the Council had done and free any humans she could find, and burn down the structures that protected the guilty, while punishing the innocent. But she would not be a monster, and she would not kill unnecessarily, and she would give people chances to walk away before the fire came. The ones who chose to stay and fight and hunt humans like animals would get what they had earned. Ember spread her wings in the confined space and tested the healed muscles, and fire flickered between her teeth. In anticipation of battles yet to come, the dragon had grown since Earth, and stress and combat had accelerated her maturation, and she was larger now and stronger, and her scales reflected light in ways that seemed to bend physic. Their bond had deepened too, and sometimes Kira was not sure where she ended and Ember began, and she could feel the dragon's instincts mixing with her own human thoughts. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts, and together they were dangerous in ways the Council had not anticipated. Kira saved her plans and shut down the console and returned to sit beside Ember and rest while they could, because tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers. She thought about Lily and the other billions who had died, and the 43 survivors scattered across the galaxy and waiting to be found. She thought about justice and revenge and the fine line between them, and which side of that line she was. Walking, she decided it did not matter, because the end result would be the same, and the Council would learn that humanity remembered, and humanity did not forgive crimes against the innocent. Rumbled softly, and Kira rested her hand on the dragon's scales and felt warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with connection. They would continue tomorrow and the day after, and however many days it took to make things re-end. If the galaxy wanted to call her a monster for fighting back, then she would wear that label with pride, because monsters from Deathworlds were the scariest kind. Research Station Meridian orbited a gas giant at a distance calculated to maximize solar collection while minimizing radiation exposure, and from the outside, it looked like any other scientific facility conducting legitimate research into useful. Kira knew better, because she had obtained the real files from Pip the data broker, and those files described experiments on human survivors that violated every ethical guideline the Council claimed to follow. 15 humans were being held in the station under the guise of voluntary medical care, but the word voluntary meant nothing when the alternative was starvation on labor colonies where no one cared if you lived or died. She approached the station using false credentials that Pip had created in a stolen maintenance vessel that looked too boring to warrant close inspection, and her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady on the controls and bewaited in the debris field nearby, because bringing a dragon to a research station would have been somewhat obvious, and through their bond, Kira could feel the dragon's frustration at being left behind, and her determination to be ready when called. The docking process went smoothly, and the security officer who checked her credentials was a bored Vorian, who barely glanced at her face before waving her through to the maintenance section. Skira walked through the station corridors with confidence that suggested she belonged there, and people tended not to question those who acted like they had every right to be somewhere there. Station security was formidable, but it was designed to keep people inside rather than keep threats out, and that was the fatal flaw in their planning because they assumed all dangers were external. She moved through ventilation systems that were too small for most species, but perfectly sized for a human who had practiced at flexibility and endurance and discomfort. The ducts brought her to the research level where the human subjects were held, and she could hear voices below speaking in council standard about test results and behavioral observation. Skier dropped from the vent into an empty corridor and moved quickly to the containment area, where she found rooms with reinforced doors and security locks that were impressive but not impossible. Inside the rooms, she found humans, and they looked thin and tired and scared, but alive. And when they saw her, their expressions changed from confusion to hope, and that look nearly broke her heart. One girl was about 9 years old, with dark hair and frightened eyes, and she reminded Kira so much of Lily that she had to pause and breathe through the pain before she could speak. She told them quietly that she was there to get them out, and they needed to stay calm and follow instructions, and some of them cried and some of them just nodded, and all of them looked at her like she was a miracle. Kira did not feel like a miracle, and she felt like a weapon that was being used for the right purpose. For once, she could not trigger alarms, yet because she needed time to get everyone ready and coordinated and positioned for evacuation, so instead she moved to the next phase of her plan. Ember received the signal through their bond, and the dragon positioned herself on the station's exterior hull, where sensors would have trouble detecting her against the backdrop of the gas giant's radiation. The Voidrake used her claws to create a precise, controlled breach in a non-essential section far from any inhabited areas in the station's emergency. Systems screamed warnings about hull integrity, failure, or evacuation. Protocols activated automatically, and non-essential personnel began moving toward escape pods according to their training, and the chaos gave Kira the cover she needed. She led the 15 humans through maintenance corridors toward the docking bay, where she had hidden a stolen cargo shuttle that was larger than her usual ship, but necessary for this many passengers. The security teams were focused on the hull breach and coordinating evacuation, and did not notice a group of humans moving through areas they should not have access to until it was too late. Tequiera had planted evidence throughout the station's computer systems during her infiltration and set it to release automatically when she left, and the files contained irrefutable proof of illegal experimentation and council complicity in Earth's destruction. The cargo shuttle launched with all 15 humans aboard plus Kira, and within seconds, council warships were converging on the station because Admiral Victoria Cross had anticipated this move and positioned her fleet nearby. Cross hailed the shuttle directly, and her voice came through the communication system with authority and something that might have been respect. Kira Hayes and I have studied your methods, and I know you gave civilians time to escape and stand down, so we can discuss terms. Kira did not respond because she was not in the shuttle, and that vessel was running on autopilot programming she had created weeks ago in preparation for exactly this scenario. She and the freed humans were in a different ship entirely, and one with cloaking technology that she had stolen from a black market dealer who would probably be very angry when he discovered the theft. The cloaked transport slipped past the council blockade while their attention was focused on the decoy shuttle, and by the time they realized the deception, it was too late. The decoy shuttle exploded in a fireball that looked dramatic and final and suggested Kira had chosen death over capture, and Cross did not believe it for a second, but had to investigate anyway. Jumps away, Kira brought the freed humans to a hidden way station operated by sympathizers who believed the council had become corrupt and needed to be challenged. The way station was run by a tiger-like alien named Rax, who had lost family to council policies, and a crystalline being named Chorus, who processed information faster than computers and saw patterns that others missed. They welcomed the humans and offered medical care and food and safety, and Rax approached Kira with an offer to join. Her fight with resources and warriors she refused because she would not make anyone else a target, and the council wanted her specifically, and anyone who helped her would become collateral damage. But she accepted their intelligence network because information was as valuable as weapons, and she needed to know where the council was moving and what they were planning. Chorus showed her data streams that revealed the location of Deep Station Obsidian, and it was hidden in a nebula and classified at the highest level, and likely contained records of surviving humans. That station became her next target, but first she needed to ensure the evidence she had planted at Meridian was spreading properly. The files were already racing across the galactic network faster than the council could suppress them, and images of human children and medical restraints were being shared by millions. Logs of council members discussing Earth's acceptable loss and classified documents proving the dimensional experiments had caused the disaster, and they had known and done nothing public. Opinion was fracturing across council space, and protests were erupting on member worlds, and independent systems were demanding investigations and accountability. Admiral Cross watched her fleet regroup after the failed capture and studied the evidence that Kira had released, and felt something inside her break and reform into a shape she did not fully recognize yet. She had 3 daughters, and they were safe and happy and protected by the same system that had let billions of humans die and called it acceptable. The images of those human children in restraints looked like they could have been her own daughters in different circumstances, and the thought made her physically ill. Cross pulled up Kira's file again and read between the lines and saw not a terrorist or criminal, but someone fighting for justice when the system designed to provide it had failed completely. She thought about orders and duty and the oath she had sworn, and what honor meant when the institution you served was dishonorable. Her officers were already leaking the files despite orders to suppress them, and several had submitted resignation requests, and the crew was talking in hushed voices about whether they were on the right side. Cross made a decision that would end her career and possibly her life, but she made it anyway because some things were more important than rank. She began quietly reaching out to other officers who shared her doubts and who had been disturbed by the evidence and who wanted to believe the council could be reformed on. She started planning for the possibility that the next time she encountered Kira Hayes, it might be as an ally instead of an enemy. Meanwhile, Kira studied the data on Deep Station Obsidian and planned her infiltration with Ember resting nearby and their bond humming with shared purpose. 43 humans left in council space, and she would find them all. The galaxy had cornered the Deathworld girl once and learned their mistake now. They would learn what happened when you gave a predator a reason to hunt. Deep Station Obsidian hung in the heart of a nebula that glowed with colors no natural phenomenon should produce, and the swirling gases played havoc with sensors and made navigation more art than science. The station was built into an asteroid 3 times the size of most moons, and bristled with weapons and automated defenses, and had more security layers than some planetary elite. Government's Kira studied the tactical data, while Ember waited in the nebula hidden among rocks that drifted through the cosmic fog, and the dragon had grown even larger, and her wingspan now rivaled small starships. Through their bond, they maintained constant contact even across the distance, and Kira drew strength from that connection and the certainty that Ember would come the instant she was called. The infiltration plan was risky, but all her plans were risky, and she had stopped worrying about danger sometime during the second cycle of running and hiding. And learning to survive, she approached in a maintenance pod that she had stolen weeks ago and programmed broadcast identification codes that suggested it belonged to the station and security systems let her pass without challenge. Inside the asteroid, she moved through corridors that were carved from rock and reinforced with metal and filled with guards who were alert and professional and well-trained, but even the best training had patterns, and those patterns created opportunities for someone who knew how to watch and wait and move when no one was looking. Kira bypassed security checkpoints, using routes through maintenance tunnels and ventilation systems and spaces between walls that architects never intended for human occupation. She reached the central archive after 3 hours of careful movement and found a room filled with holographic displays and data storage systems and the accumulated secrets of council crimes. Archive contained everything and locations of human survivors and proof of dimensional experiments, and evidence of other civilizations that the Council had quietly erased from History 43 humans scattered across Council space, and she downloaded their locations and planned extraction routes and memorized faces she had never seen before, but would find eventually she was copying the final files when alarms began to scream and red lights flooded the corridor, and she knew she had triggered a silent security measure, that she had missed the station went into lockdown and blast doors slammed shut, and automated weapons emerged from walls, and every guard on the facility began converging on her position. Kira was prepared to fight her way out because that was always an option, but then something unexpected happened. Admiral Victoria Cross's voice came through the station communication system and announced that she was approaching alone and unarmed and wanted to talk. The guards looked confused because admirals did not typically walk into combat zones without protection. Cross was done following standard procedure. Kira watched through security cameras as the admiral landed her shuttle and walked through corridors full of weapons that could have killed her instantly, and her face showed determination rather than fear. They met in the archive, surrounded by evidence of everything the council had done wrong, and Cross removed her admiral insignia and placed it carefully on a console. I am resigning my commission, and I have daughters, Kira, and when I saw those children in restraints, I could not serve a council that does this, and others feel the same, and we want to help. Kira kept her weapon ready because trust was almost impossible now, but she saw genuine remorse in Cross's eyes, and something more that looked like a mother's protective rage. Before she could respond, the station shuddered, and not from weapons or explosions, but from something deeper and more fundamental, and the walls began to crack. Dimensional rifts were appearing in the nebula, an opening like wounds in reality, and the same energies that had consumed Earth were manifesting here because the Council had not learned anything there. Experiments on the station had been ongoing despite the disaster on Earth, and they were still trying to harness dimensional energy for faster travel and more efficient power generation. The rifts spread like infection through the nebula and touched the asteroid, in reality began to tear apart at the fundamental level. Cross and Kira shared a look of horrified understanding, and all their conflict became irrelevant when faced with annihilation. Kira called Ember through their bond, and the dragon came tearing through the nebula with wings spread wide and fire trailing behind her like a comet made of rage. The Void Drake crashed through the station's docking bay and shattered reinforced walls to reach Kira, and guards scattered because no one wanted to stand between a bonded dragon and her. Human Cross began broadcasting orders to her fleet and commanded them to evacuate everyone from the station regardless of rank or species or guilt. Admiral had brought enough ships to mount a siege, but instead she used them for rescue, and her officers responded instantly because they had been waiting for orders that made moral sense. Kira and Cross worked together and moved through collapsing corridors to reach prisoners and researchers and even guards who were trapped by the dimensional rifts. They saved hundreds of lives. As the station tore itself apart and reality fractured around them, and the nebula turned from beautiful to deadly, Ember carried groups of survivors on her back and flew them to waiting ships and made trip after trip despite exhaustion and the burns from passing too close. Two-dimensional tears. The last section of the station collapsed into a rift that consumed the asteroid and all its secrets, and left only fragments drifting in cosmic fog that would eventually dissipate in the bridge of the dawning light, which was Admiral Cross's former flagship. Kira stood beside the woman who had been her enemy and watched the destruction through viewport. Ember coiled nearby. Her scales reflected the nebula's dying light, and through their bond Kira felt the dragon's exhaustion, but also satisfaction at having saved lives. 33 humans left according to the data she had downloaded, and she would find them all, no matter how long it took or how far she had to travel. Cross spoke quietly about other officers who shared her doubts and fleets she could access and resources that could support a proper search and rescue operation. The Council's leadership was still in power. They would fight to maintain authority and suppress evidence and hunt anyone who challenged them. But now Kira had allies and people who believed that justice mattered more than orders and that protecting the innocent was worth risking. Everything Ember raised her head and sensed something. Through the nebula's distortions, and Kira felt it too, through their bond dragons. Dozens of them moving through space, toward their position, and drawn by Ember's presence and the psychic. Resonance of bonded pairs, they had emerged from Earth's final days scattered across the galaxy when the dimensional rifts had thrown them into random trajectories. Some had bonded with aliens who found them, and some had bonded with the few humans who survived, and all of them had been searching for others. Like themselves now, they gathered in the nebula like a constellation of living stars, and their scales reflected every color that existed, and some that physics said should not be possibly. Era realized the truth that humanity was not extinct, but scattered and bonded to creatures of myth and waiting to be reunited. When they gathered together with their dragons, they would be unstoppable, and the council would learn what happened when you tried to erase a species that refused to die. Admiral Cross watched the dragons arrive and understood that the galaxy's balance of power just shifted permanently. Kira touched the viewport and watched the void drakes dance through cosmic fog and felt hope for the first time since Earth died. Ember rumbled contentedly and fire flickered between her teeth. And through their bond, Kira felt the dragon's joy at finding others of her kind. Council had cornered the Deathworld girl and destroyed her home and hunted her across stars, but they had not broken her, and they had not ended humanity, and they had not accounted for what happens when survivors bond with dragons. Now Kira was not just a fugitive or a fighter or even a symbol of resistance. She is the ember that would spark humanity's rebirth, and when that fire spread across the galaxy, it would burn away corruption and lies only. The floor would remain still, and by floor she meant the foundation, and that foundation would be built on justice and remembrance and the promise that no species would ever be erased again. The real war was beginning, and this time humanity would not fight alone. They would fight with fire and wings and the bond between souls that transcended species. The galaxy would learn that Deathworlds did not create victims, they created survivors who became protectors, who would defend the helpless with everything they had. Smiled as she watched the dragons gather, and felt Ember's warmth beside her, and knew that somewhere out there, 42 other humans were waiting. She would find them. A land together, they would make sure that what happened to Earth never happened again. The floor remained still beneath her feet, and around her the universe trembled with the promise of change, and that was exactly how it should be.